jak to, co się działo przez ostatnie 24 miesiące. Jak podchodzisz do takiej teorii?
Teraz czekamy na lądowanie kosmitów. Dzisiaj w rozmowie ze mną Marcin Mastny wspomniał o jakimś takim mieście podziemnym, które jest budowane w Nowej Zelandii. Temat mnie strasznie zafascynował. Szczególnie, że mi bardzo przypasował do tej nieprawdopodobnej teorii o Raptalianach, czyli tych rasie złej, demonicznej, która żyje pod ziemią. Więc żyjemy w takich czasach, że na dzień dzisiejszy rzeczy, które widzieliśmy w filmach science fiction, które były nieprawdopodobne, z dnia na dzień nam się realizują. To by jeszcze 2 lata temu przypuszczał, że rząd zakaże nam oddychania świeżym powietrzem i ludzie karnie się do tego dostosują. Kto by przypuszczał, że nagle rząd wymyśli, że zamykamy przedsiębiorstwa i doprowadzamy do ruiny. Albo będziemy wszystkim wszczykiwać preparat, który według definicji sprzed pandemii jest preparatem nieprzebadanym.
No, premier Morawiecki dzisiaj ogłosił, że zdejmuje wszystkie restrykcje, ale później wyjaśnił, że chodzi o te najmniej istotne, bo maseczki, kwarantanna i izolacja zostają, więc jakie to jest znaczenie restrykcji?
Nie wiem, może będzie można polemizować. Na przykład może Jan Pospieszalski wróci i gdzieś tam w okolicach pierwszej w nocy będzie mógł prowadzić rozmowy z naukowcami.
Czyli wierzysz w powrót debaty i w jakieś lepsze standardy?
Może, bo ja tak nie wiemy, o co chodzi.
On either side. Given where we are now, though, given the reality of the situation on the ground, what do you think is the best possible outcome in Ukraine that we can see to end the hostilities, to save human life?
Well, Russia's been very clear what its goals are. They've offered talks with Zelensky. If Zelensky is serious about talking, they offered to quote the terms of surrender, which are the terms that they've been saying all along. This is nothing new. They want the demilitarization of Ukraine. They want Ukraine to remain as a non-NATO member, like Switzerland or Austria, and if this were to take place, let's not forget Zelensky was elected with the support of a lot of the pro-Russian speakers because he ran as someone who would open dialogue with Moscow. Unfortunately, he fell in with a bad crowd in Washington and London and turned his back on that. But I think the best outcome would be a neutral Ukraine. It's what Russia wants. Certainly, it's good for everyone. There's no benefit to the West to having Ukraine in NATO.
Some politicians in Ukraine are calling on their government to negotiate with Russia. That's as Zelensky calls on Ukrainian citizens to take up arms against Russian soldiers. Now, can you see that realistically happening, a return to the negotiating table, given that diplomatic ties, of course, are now severed?
Well, we're looking at Kiev that's increasingly looking encircle the Ukrainians for all the billions of dollars in weapons that the U.S. and the West have given them, for all the training that the CIA has given them. It looks a little bit like the Afghan army after the U.S. pulled out. It just disintegrated. So they're not fighting a very convincing fight right now. I don't see very many options. NATO will not come to their aid, and I think they've realized that. The United States will not come to their military aid. It's a lot of rhetoric. It's a lot of hot air. But as far as the U.S. getting involved or the NATO getting involved, it's not going to happen. Negotiation seems to be the only option they have.
But let's just go back in time here, because we're still waiting on updated casualty figures for what's going on over the last 12 to 14 hours. The Russian Defense Ministry is saying the casualties are non-existent or minimal. The Ukrainians are claiming there are more civilian casualties. But this conflict has been raging for 8 years now, and we do know thousands have died in the east of Ukraine because of shelling on both sides. Yet that conflict was largely ignored, largely put on hold by many Western powers. Why do you think that was put on the back burner, not such a priority to solve? Yet as things have escalated now, this has become the focus of attention.
Because as often happens, the U.S. foreign policy establishment believes its own rhetoric. It believes its own bumper stickers. That somehow has this triumphalist idea that after the U.S.-backed overthrow in 2014, we've got this. This is our prize. Well, things don't work this way in the real world. And I think we're seeing a realization now that this is the result of U.S. interventionism. The U.S. caused this problem. It doesn't mean that we are cheering the military action right now. It's terrible. It's awful. But the fact is, it could have been avoided if we had not overthrown an elected government in Ukraine and had not shipped a bunch of weapons. So hopefully the U.S. will change its foreign policy to be a more pro-America foreign policy. That's certainly what I endorse.
Well, that's all we have time for today. Daniel McAdams is Executive Director of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Thanks for your time here today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Our next 30 documentary brings you the stories of residents in the so-called grey zone, that contact line between the newly recognised independent republics in the east of Ukraine and Kiev. We're back in half an hour with the very latest. Join us again here on RT International.
That are clearly moving into Ukraine.
Grey zone inhabitants have learned to sleep through the nighttime shelling
and it has
to
been
live without
said
the most
all along
basic
that
utilities, going for weeks without clean water or electricity. Worst of all, they've had to watch as the war creeps ever closer to their homes.
34-й это крайний по нашей стороне дом.
Airfield 15 miles from Kyiv that's been taken by Russian paratroopers. Is there a counterattack? How do they take that airfield back? It is those kind of key places that we'll see. And the Russians have been taking out command and control structures and infrastructure pieces. They want to make this country ungovernable. It's not clear how wide this invasion will be, but the purpose of it is clear.
All right, Cal Perry for us there. Cal, we cannot thank you for your reporting. I know you have probably barely slept, and you have covered every single twist and turn for weeks, and we cannot thank you enough. We appreciate you, man.
Now, the United States, along with its allies, swiftly moved to place sanctions on Russia after its military forces were ordered into Ukrainian territory. But can these sanctions actually slow Russia down? NBC News national security correspondent Ken Dilanian is joining us now from Washington. Ken, severe economic sanctions are expected as a response to Russia's invasion, more than what we've already seen. Do we have a sense of just how much farther the U.S. could go?
On the sanctions front, it's up in the air right now, Aaron. What's being contemplated is dramatic, including up to and including isolating Russia from the dollar economy, which could have severe impacts on the Russian economy. It could also reverberate to the U.S. economy. But we also have very important new reporting at NBC News that President Biden has been presented with options for cyber retaliation against Russia in response to its invasion of Ukraine. Options designed to slow down Russia's ability to resupply its troops and also to make Russia pay a price, everything from turning off the internet to disrupting trains. This is a dramatic development, actually. I've been covering cyber issues for more than 10 years. I've never seen this kind of far-reaching proposal reach an American president. Whether Biden actually pulls the trigger on this is another question, but the American cyber warriors and cyber intelligence officials have been preparing these kinds of options for many, many years, and now they are presenting them to the president. It's designed to be options short of what would be considered an act of war, so things that would disrupt but not destroy, things that are designed not to hurt Russians, but to disrupt networks, but nonetheless would be a significant step and could result in retaliation by Russia against the United States and an escalation. And that's why there's a big debate going on within the Biden administration right now.
Well, Ken, I want to stick on that since you brought it up, and this is something that we obviously have not seen deployed before to the degree that you've just described. Any indications at this point to whether the president, this is something that he would pursue, or how much force there's behind the recommendation that he might pursue these options.
That is the big question. I just got off the phone with Senator Mark Warner, who's the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, and he was raising a cautionary note about this, saying that, look, when you start deploying malware, cyber weapons essentially, against
I'd like to offer my wholehearted support for much tougher sanctions against President Putin and his dreadful regime. Mr. Speaker, as the honourable gentleman
to jest jednak rekord, uważam. No. Jeszcze szybko zdradzam, kto, ile i dlaczego. I dlaczego tak mało. Ania, smacznego, mieszkam w Southampton, słucham was codziennie. Dzięki. Małgosia, zjadłam jednego, ale dużego.
Radio PRL.
Jeszcze wpis Reni. Ci, co wiedzieli, to wiedzą, że 3. A to, co ja wiem, to kilka więcej. Ja też swoje wiem.
Just so you can fill me with you even when I'm not around. Don't forget my love. Don't forget my love. Don't forget my love. My love. Don't forget my love. Don't forget my love. Don't forget my love.
czasu polskiego Władimir Władimirowicz Putin oficjalnie wypowiedział w imieniu Rosji wojnę Ukrainie. I dalej zaczyna się coś, co można by śmiało nazwać komedią absurdów, która mogłaby posłużyć do nakręcenia genialnej komedii, która wszak chyba byłaby na tyle niewiarygodna, że ludziom by się nie spodobała. Ale niestety, drodzy Państwo, to, co się dzieje, dzieje się naprawdę. I to nie jest śmieszne tylko dlatego, że w wyniku tego, co się dzieje, drodzy Państwo, przepraszam, ludzie tracą życie, ludzie tracą zdrowie, ludzie tracą majątek, a i Polska rykoszetem już teraz, drodzy Państwo, bardzo mocno obrywa, a oberwie jeszcze bardziej. Bo na razie to tylko, w cudzysłowie, tracimy nasze oszczędności, bo złotówka znowu poleciała na łeb na szyję. Znowu możemy się spodziewać drakońskiej inflacji, bo wszyscy będą skupować dobra jak się tylko da. I w zasadzie tylko chyba posiadacze złota się cieszą, bo cena uncji w chwili, w której nagrywam ten vlog, przekroczyła już psychologiczną granicę 8000 zł, a w dolarze przekroczyła już $1925. Zbliża się do bardzo potężnego psychologicznego wsparcia 2000, które też pewnie niedługo przekroczy. Ale także mógłbym mówić, a nie mówiłem. Ci wszyscy, co się ze mnie śmiali, że mówiłem, że warto kupować złoto. No ale tak nie powiem, bo tutaj nie o to chodzi, żeby się chełpić, że człowiek miał rację, tylko, drodzy Państwo, trzeba analizować sytuację, bo ta zmienia się z minuty na minutę i jest, drodzy Państwo, bardzo groźna dla naszego kraju. Niestety scenariusz wlania się do Polski milionów uchodźców z Ukrainy, którzy poprzez niefrasobliwość graniczącą z głupotą lub coś większym naszego rządu wleją się głównie, a może nawet przede wszystkim do naszego kraju i zostaną rozlokowani na dość niedużym obszarze 2 województw, więc zaczną tam stanowić bardzo duży procent społeczeństwa, no to, drodzy Państwo, ten scenariusz właśnie się realizuje. A jak sobie obejrzycie chociażby mój vlog z Zielonej Poświaty, który miał być wyemitowany we wtorek, a został w środę, no to już jest daleko posunięty punkt bardzo okropnego scenariusza, który tak umownie nazywa się 4., a niektórzy twierdzą, że 5. rozbiorem Polski. Także, drodzy Państwo, teorie, które człowiek tam sobie nagrywał w celach rozrywkowych w Zielonej Poświecie, strasznie szybko zaczynają stawać się prawdą i mnie to pioruńsko, drodzy Państwo, przeraża. Zapraszam do przejrzenia playlisty, znaczy nie playlisty, wejścia na stronę główną kanału Wideo Prezentacja, wejścia do zakładki wideo i tam macie wszystkie nasze filmy i sobie przejrzyjcie te takie właśnie o 4. rozbiorze Polski, o planie destabilizacji Polski, drodzy Państwo, bo niezależnie od tego, czy to jest plan, czy seria przypadkowych działań, to, drodzy Państwo, do destabilizacji to prowadzi. I to bardzo, bardzo szybko. Ale teraz, drodzy Państwo, wróćmy do Ukrainy, do cynizmu Władimira Putina i do realizowania scenariusza cyrylicą pisanego, albo jakąś inną, bo nie wiadomo, drodzy Państwo, po jakiemu tam dokładnie piszą te scenariusze, który się dzieje, który jest wyjątkowo podły, drodzy Państwo. Rosja zaatakowała Ukrainę, zaatakowała ją podle, bo zaczęła od, może inaczej, może najpierw formalnie. Drodzy Państwo, Putin poszedł w jeden z tych scenariuszy, który uznawałem za najbardziej prawdopodobny scenariusz eskalacyjny w ostatnich vlogach, czyli broni siebie i broni tych republik, tych 2 zbuntowanych republik, które uznał za niepodległe. I tam wykorzystuje ten fakt, że te republiki trzymają niejako w zasadzie, czy trzymały, bo do chwili, w której ten vlog się zrenderuje i wrzuci, to możliwe, że już Putin już zajął to terytorium, ale one przed agresją Putina, tą obecną z 2022 roku, posiadały mniej terytorium niż chciały posiadać. One po prostu zajęły sobie jakiś skrawek Ukrainy, ale twierdziły, że im się należy więcej, ponieważ w tych granicach sprzed 2014, granicach administracyjnych, to one miały więcej terytorium. W związku z tym Putin, po uznaniu ich za niepodległe, uznał, że Ukraina okupuje część terytorium tych 2 bytów państwowych, które on uznał za suwerenne i z którymi ma podpisane umowy o wzajemnej pomocy, wsparciu, również militarne, i zaczął ich wspierać po to, żeby im oddać to, co według niego zagarnęła Ukraina. Wyobrażacie sobie, Ukraina tutaj jest jako agresor. Ja to nawet tłumaczyłem swego czasu na mieszkaniach, jak to działa. Po prostu, Ukraina agresor, bo separatyści nie zdołali zabrać tyle, co chcieli, więc Putin uznał, że trzeba im pomóc zabrać więcej. Do tego jeszcze Putin wymyślił sobie historyjkę, która jest też w Polsce powtarzana przez, nie wiem, czy już oficjalnie można mówić, prorosyjską agenturę, prorosyjskich agentów wpływu, może też tych idiotów, a może ludzi, którzy po prostu, nie wiem, co, w każdym razie wymyślili sobie, że Ukraina ma broń atomową. Pies z tym, że nie ma. Pies z tym, że nie ma ze względu na to, że oddała w zamian za gwarancję bezpieczeństwa, między innymi rosyjskie. Czajcie, Ukraina miała 3. największy arsenał nuklearny zaraz po Stanach Zjednoczonych i Rosji. To trzecia była Ukraina. Chiny nawet miały mniejsze, słuchajcie. I oni to, przepraszam za wrażenie, frajerzy oddali w zamian za gwarancję bezpieczeństwa Stanów Zjednoczonych, Wielkiej Brytanii i Rosji. I te 3 kraje obiecały, że będą pilnować, żeby nigdy w życiu granice Ukrainy nie zostały naruszone. No to właśnie jeden z tych krajów, to co obiecał, że nie będą naruszone, to atakuje Ukrainę, a 2 kolejne siedzą i się gapią i robią na tym biznesy. Bo to Polska to na tym straci, ale Wielka Brytania i Stany Zjednoczone robią na tym biznesy, a Stany Zjednoczone dodatkowo realizują moim zdaniem cel, jakim jest związanie części sił rosyjskich przed moim zdaniem planowanym atakiem na Chiny. To w dzisiejszym vlogu porannym dokładnie o tym mówiłem, o co chodzi. Stanom Zjednoczonym, Rosji, Chinom, tam tutaj też pojawiała trochę Turcja i Izrael jako takie 2 małe, ale dość ważne kraje. Drodzy Państwo, i sobie wymyślili, że Ukraina ma broń atomową i dlatego ją zaatakują, żeby ona jej nie użyła. Kurde, to takie trochę przeczy logice, no bo generalnie jak ktoś zaatakowany ma atomicę, to właśnie wtedy je użyje, nie? Na przykład Korea Północna ma atomicę i dlatego nikt ich nie atakuje, bo się boją, że użyje Kim Jong-un, nie? No ale tutaj Ukraina ma mieć, ale to nie przeszkadza. Będą ginąć, ale nie użyją. Taka chora narracja, która, co ciekawe, do niektórych trafia. Według drugiej narracji Putin się broni, bo Ukraina chce zdobyć dopiero broń atomową. Chce dopiero zdobyć. Jeszcze nie ma, ale chce zdobyć. To jest o tyle ciekawe i tutaj należy być uczciwym, należy podkreślić, że to jest generalnie to samo modus operandi, które stosują Stany Zjednoczone. Tutaj tak, no ja bardzo mocno potępiam agresywność Rosji, agresywność Putina, ale jako uczciwy człowiek muszę zwrócić uwagę, że Stany Zjednoczone w ostatnich dziesięcioleciach były ostro agresywne i jak chciały kogoś zaatakować, to stosowały dokładnie te sztuczki, jakie w tej chwili stosuje Putin. Można wręcz powiedzieć, że Putin z nich zerżnął, że Amerykanie powinni im wystawić fakturę za licencję na ich preteksty. Pewnie pamiętacie, jak Stany Zjednoczone najechały drugi raz Irak, to też mówiły, że Irak ma broń masowego rażenia, której tam potem kompletnie nie było, nie znaleźli, ale nieważne, już i tak zdestabilizowali sobie Irak i wszyscy wiemy, co się tam teraz dzieje. Także Putin od strony politycznej gra idealnie kopią tego, co zwykle robią Stany Zjednoczone. Ten atak na Ukrainę jest barbarzyński. Od razu powiem, jest kurde barbarzyński. I to, co Rosjanie robią Ukraińcom, to jest straszne. Przykro mi, naprawdę mi przykro. Nawet jako człowiekowi, który zna historię, który potrafi wybaczyć, aż nigdy nie zapomni, jest mi tak cholernie przykro, co oni im robią. Słuchajcie, wiecie, w jaki sposób Rosja broni siebie? Znaczy, żeby nie było, że mi ktoś to kurde nie wyciął z kontekstu. Rosja twierdzi, że broni siebie i tam tych republik i tak dalej, bombarduje miasta. Drodzy Państwo, bombarduje miasta. Drodzy Państwo, to jest po prostu jakiś kurde dramat. Ludzie się obudzili, bo im pociski artyleryjskie i rozumiem też rakietowe spadły na bloki mieszkalne w miastach. Putin twierdzi, że nie chce okupować Ukrainy, nie w ogóle, kurde, robi tam desanty po to, żeby ich nie okupować. To standardowa zagrywka amerykańska, Amerykanie podobnie robią. Tylko chce ich zdemilitaryzować, żeby nie stanowili już zagrożenia dla tych dwóch republik i żeby nie stanowili zagrożenia dla Rosji. Słuchajcie, tą demilitaryzację rozpoczyna od mordu na cywilach? Bo to chyba tak trzeba nazwać, nie? Drodzy Państwo, ostrzał artyleryjski i bombardowaniem i ostrzał rakietowy, bo to raczej głównie rakietowy ze względu na odległości, miast, drodzy Państwo, to jest mord na ludności cywilnej. Co ma demilitaryzacja, czyli niszczenie potencjału militarnego do tego, że ktoś już się nie obudzi, bo rakieta rozpierdzieli blok, w którym spał. To jest, drodzy Państwo, tak złe, tak okropne, tak bardzo to potępiam. że nawet, że po prostu przykro mi, wiecie, oczy mi się w tym momencie szklą, nie wiem, czy to widać, ale spoko. Trzeba ciągnąć dalej i nie dlatego, że jakoś specjalnie ukochałem jakiś naród, nie, tylko drodzy Państwo, ja sobie pomyślę, że w tych blokach tam były dzieci. Ja pierdolę, Putin, ty kurde zbrodniarzu, tak nie można. Dobra, oczywiście jest wezwanie do złożenia broni.
The other allies, the rest of NATO, adding their own forces and capabilities to ensure collective defense. And today, within hours of Russia's unleashing its assault, NATO came together and authorized and activated an activation of response plans. This will enable NATO's high readiness forces to deploy and when and where they are needed to protect our NATO allies on the eastern boundaries of Europe. And now I'm authorizing additional U.S. force capabilities to deploy to Germany as part of NATO's response, including some of the U.S.-based forces that the Department of Defense placed on standby weeks ago. I've also spoken with Defense Secretary Austin and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, about preparations for additional moves should they become necessary to protect our NATO allies and support the greatest military alliance in the history of the world, NATO. As we respond, my administration is using the tools, every tool at its disposal to protect American families and businesses from rising prices at the gas pump. You know, we're taking active steps to bring down the cost, and American oil and gas companies should not exploit this moment to hike their prices to raise profits. You know, in our sanctions package, we specifically designed to allow energy payments to continue. We are closely monitoring energy supplies for any disruption. We've been coordinating with major oil producing and consuming countries toward our common interest to secure global energy supplies. We are actively working with countries around the world to elevate collective release from the strategic petroleum reserves of major energy consuming countries. And the United States will release additional barrels of oil as conditions warrant. I know this is hard and that Americans are already hurting. I will do everything in my power to limit the pain the American people are feeling at the gas pump. This is critical to me. But this aggression cannot go unanswered. If it did, the consequences for America would be much worse. America stands up to bullies. We stand up for freedom. This is who we are. Let me also repeat the warning I made last week. If Russia pursues cyber attacks against our companies, our critical infrastructure, we are prepared to respond. For months, we've been working closely with the private sector to harden their cyber defenses, sharpen our ability to respond to Russian cyber attacks as well. I spoke last night to President Zelensky of Ukraine, and I assured him that the United States, together with our allies and partners in Europe, will support the Ukrainian people as they defend their country. We'll provide humanitarian relief to ease their suffering. And in the early days of this conflict, Russia propaganda outlets will keep trying to hide the truth and claim success for its military operation against a made-up threat. But history has shown, time and again, how swift gains in territory, acts of mass civil and strategic way to grinding occupations, acts of mass civil disobedience, and strategic dead ends. The next few weeks and months will be hard on the people of Ukraine. Putin has unleashed a great pain on them, but the Ukrainian people have known 30 years of independence. They have repeatedly shown that they will not tolerate anyone who tries to take their country backwards. This is a dangerous moment for all of Europe, for the freedom around the world. Putin has committed an assault on the very principles that uphold the global peace. But now, the entire world sees clearly what Putin and his Kremlin allies are really all about. This was never about a genuine security concerns on their part. It was always about naked aggression, about Putin's desire for empire by any means necessary, by bullying Russia's neighbors through coercion and corruption, by changing borders by force, and ultimately by choosing a war without a cause. Putin's actions betray his sinister vision for the future of our world, one where nations take what they want by force. But it is a vision that the United States and freedom-loving nations everywhere will oppose with every tool of our considerable power. The United States and our allies and partners will emerge from this stronger, more united, more determined, and more purposeful. And Putin's aggression against Ukraine will end up costing Russia dearly, economically and strategically. We will make sure of that. Putin will be a pariah on the international stage. Any nation that countenances Russia's naked aggression against Ukraine will be stained by association. When the history of this era is written, Putin's choice to make a totally unjustifiable war on Ukraine will have left Russia weaker and the rest of the world stronger. Liberty, democracy, human dignity, these are the forces far more powerful than fear and oppression. They cannot be extinguished by tyrants like Putin and his armies. They cannot be erased by from people's hearts and hopes by any amount of violence and intimidation. They endure. In the contest between democracy and autocracy, between sovereignty and subjugation, make no mistake, freedom will prevail. God bless the people of a free and democratic Ukraine. May God protect our troops. Mr. President. Associated Press, Zeke.
So do you have any plans to speak with President Putin at this point? And what interactions have you had with the Russian government?
I heard the first part. Do I have any plans to speak with Putin at this point, and what?
What communications have you had with the Kremlin as far as military operations in Ukraine and making sure this does not spiral into a larger conflict?
Well, it's a large conflict already. The way we're going to ensure it's not going to aspire to a larger conflict is by providing all the forces needed in the Eastern European nations that are members of NATO. NATO is more united than it's ever been, and I have no plans to talk with Putin. Wall Street Journal, Tarina.
Mr. President, you didn't mention SWIFT in your sanctions that you announced. Is there a reason why the U.S. Isn't doing that? Is there a disagreement among allies regarding SWIFT and whether Russia should be allowed to be a part of it?
The sanctions that we've proposed on all their banks are of equal consequence, maybe more consequence than SWIFT, number one. Number two, it is always an option, but right now that's not the position that the rest of Europe wishes to take. Cecilia Vega, ABC.
Sir, sanctions clearly have not been enough to deter Vladimir Putin to this point. What is going to stop him? How and when does this end? And do you see him trying to go beyond Ukraine? And a second question I'll just give to you now. This statement that he gave last night, the threat that he gave, the West will face consequences greater than any you have faced in history. Is he threatening a nuclear strike?
I have no idea what he's threatening. I know what he has done, number one. And number two, no one expected the sanctions to prevent anything from happening. It has to show, this is going to take time, and we have to show resolve. So he knows what's coming. And so the people of Russia know what he's brought on them. That's what this is all about. This is going to take time. It's not going to occur. He's going to say, oh my God, these sanctions are coming. I'm going to stand down. He's going to test the resolve of the West to see if we stay together. And we will. We will, and it will impose significant costs on him.
Will he go beyond Ukraine, sir? Do you see him going beyond?
Yes.
Thank you. Two topics, just really quick. First, markets are down and gas prices are up. I know you always stress the difference between Wall Street and Main Street, but everybody seems to be in for some economic pain. How economically painful is it going to get for people in this country? And I do have one more question.
First of all, there's no doubt that when a major nuclear power attacks and invades another country, that the world is going to respond. And markets can respond all over the world. So there's no doubt about that, number one. Number two, the notion that this is going to last for a long time is highly unlikely as long as we continue to stay resolved in imposing the sanctions we're going to impose on Russia, period. What's the next question? I'm sorry.
The next question is, did you underestimate Putin, and would you still describe him the way that you did in the summer as a worthy adversary?
At the time, I made it clear as an adversary, and I said he was worthy. I didn't underestimate him. And I've read most of everything he's written. Did you read I'm not a wise guy. You heard the speech he made, almost an hour's worth of speeches, why he was going into Ukraine. He has much larger ambitions in Ukraine. He wants to, in fact, reestablish the former Soviet Union. That's what this is about. And I think that his ambitions are completely contrary to the place where the rest of the world has arrived.
You're confident that these devastating sanctions are going to be as devastating as Russian missiles and bullets and tanks?
Yes, Russian bullets, missiles, and tanks in Ukraine. Yes, I am.
Thank you, President Biden. If sanctions cannot stop President Putin, what penalty can?
I didn't say sanctions couldn't stop him.
You've been talking about the threat of these sanctions for several weeks now.
Yes, but the threat of the sanctions and imposing the sanctions and seeing the effect of the sanctions are two different things. They're two different things. And he's going to begin to see the effect of the sanctions.
And what will that do? How will that change his mindset here, given he's
because
attacking
it will so
Ukraine
weaken his country that he'll have to make a very, very difficult choice as to whether to continue to move toward being a second-rate power or, in fact, respond.
You said in recent weeks that big nations cannot bluff when it comes to something like this. You recently said that the idea of personally sanctioning President Putin was on the table. Is that a step that you're prepared to take? And if not,
it's not a bluff, it's on the table.
Sanctioning President Putin?
Yes.
Why not sanction him today, sir?
Mr. President?
Why not sanction him today, sir?
Mr. President, if I can, you detailed some severe and swift new sanctions today and said the impact it will have over time. But given the full-scale invasion, given that you're not pursuing disconnecting Russia from what's called SWIFT, the international banking system, or other sanctions at your disposal, respectfully, sir, what more are you waiting for?
Specifically, with the sanctions we've imposed exceed SWIFT. The sanctions we imposed exceed anything that's ever been done. The sanctions we imposed have generated 2/3 of the world joining us. They are profound sanctions. Let's have a conversation in another month or so to see if they're working. Yes.
Can I ask you about Zelensky? Sir, you spoke to Vladimir Zelensky yesterday, sir.
What's the risk that we are watching the beginning of another Cold War, and is there now a complete rupture in U.S. and Russian relations?
There is a complete rupture right now in U.S.-Russian relations if they continue on this path that they're on. And in terms of a Cold War, that depends. You have the vast majority of the rest of the world in total opposition to what he's doing, from Asia to South America to Europe to around the world. And so it's going to be a cold day for Russia. The idea, you don't see a whole lot of people coming to his defense.
And are you, if I could follow up, sir, are you urging China to help isolate Russia? Are you urging China to help isolate Russia?
I'm not prepared to comment on that at the moment. No. Yeah. No. He's had his hand up a long time.
Thank you, Mr. President. How concerned are you that Putin wants to go beyond Ukraine into other countries, and the U.S. will have to get involved if he moves into NATO countries?
Well, if he did move into NATO countries, he will be involved. We will be involved. The only thing that I'm convinced of is if we don't stop now, he'll be emboldened. If we don't move against him now with these significant sanctions, he will be emboldened. And look, anyway.
Can you talk anything more about your conversation? Mr. President.
Why not sanction Putin directly today?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Sir, India, which is a major defense partner of the United States, is India fully with you on the issue of Ukraine and Russia?
Does the Defense Department of the United States?
So India is one of your major defense partners. Is India fully in sync with the United States on Russia?
We're in consultation with India today. We haven't resolved that completely.
One more question.
Okay, thank you all very much. Thank you.
There we are, Joe Biden at the White House. You're watching a special program on the Ukraine crisis, which today became the Ukraine war. Let's go live to the White House and US correspondent Mark Stone. And Mark, eventually, after 13 or 14 hours, we see and hear from Joe Biden. What did you make of what he had to say?
Well, many audiences that he was speaking to, he had to present a united Western Front, and I think he did, but he did not announce the rest or the full raft of sanctions that some have been calling for him to do, given what happened last night. He was asked repeatedly about this idea of cutting Russia off from the SWIFT banking system, and he made the point that actually others have been making through the course of the day, that this SWIFT banking system idea could be somewhat of a red herring. The raft of other sanctions against individual banks with huge reserves outside of the Russian Federation could have as much or more impact. That was certainly his argument. He spent the first half of that statement merely reminding people of the gravity of the moment, of what had happened, of the fact that the United States had been warning that this would happen for so many months now, and that his intelligence had got it bang on, that precisely what they warned would happen did happen. And then he outlined the raft of sanctions that he says the United States and the European Union, the UK and others would now impose on Russia. The subtext of what he was saying seemed to be that this will be a very, very difficult few months, maybe longer, for Ukraine, and that the fact is Russia is in the process of occupying Ukraine. He didn't say as much, but that seemed to be the subtext. But he made the point that Russia will feel the consequences of that decision for many, many years to come. Vladimir Putin will, he said, be a pariah. He also outlined a plan to not only buttress the eastern frontier of NATO even more, with forces right now, American forces moving from Western Europe into countries on the east, but he talked too about more American troops moving from the United States to Germany to backfill those that are moving east. He made absolutely clear that while Ukraine may have been occupied now by Russian forces, there is no prospect of any NATO member country coming into contact with Russia without Article 5 being triggered. Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all. That is why he said American troops are moving to the east of NATO, the NATO territory. And once again, he made a point he has made so many times, Mark. There is no prospect of American troops moving into Ukraine. Why? Well, quite simply because Russia is a nuclear power, and we all heard what President Putin said in his statement last night, a very ominous threat to the West.
Absolutely. Mark Stone, thank you very much indeed. So what began as shelling in Ukraine's disputed regions has grown into an invasion from the north, the south and the east. It is the biggest attack on a European country since the Second World War and Moscow's most aggressive action since the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan back in 1979. Russia has confirmed a ground incursion from Crimea in the south, while a spokesman for Ukraine's president says the Chernobyl nuclear power plant is now under Russian control in the north, and paratroopers seized an airfield just outside Kiev, although President Zelensky's office says that is now back under Ukrainian control. In a moment, we'll hear from our correspondents across Ukraine and in Moscow with Alex Rossi in Mariupol, John Sparks in Kharkiv and Diana Magnay in the Russian capital. But first, our main report tonight comes from Sky's chief correspondent, Stuart Ramsey, here in Kiev.
Here we go. It started before dawn. Ukraine woke to explosions around the capital, Kiev. It was the same across the country. These pictures from Kharkiv in the east. Enormous blasts, also in the city of Dnipro. Air raid sirens blared out across the capital. Above the clouds, a fighter jet soared over our heads, Russian or Ukrainian, we don't know which. This was to be a day of targeted attacks by the Russian forces.
Whoever tries to hinder us, and even more so to create threats to our country, to our people, should know that Russia's response will be immediate, and it will lead you to such consequences that you have never encountered in your history.
Shocked witnesses filmed this video of missiles hitting the Ivano-Frankivsk airport in the country's west. Russia appeared to be targeting essential infrastructure, helicopter gunships hovering above a power plant. Other power stations were targeted as well, including the Chernobyl nuclear power station, raising fears of an even greater disaster. Ukraine's president held an emergency meeting with his top staff, pledging the fight will go on.
What Ukrainians should do: help the national defense, join the national armed forces, territorial defense. Anyone with experience in the army. It's really important, and we will not let the enemy go any further on our territory.
Russian armoured personnel carriers and other military vehicles crossed the border from Belarus into Ukraine as President Putin's forces attempted to take control. Military trucks also seen heading north from Crimea, annexed in 2014. And tanks rolled through the cities, including Sumy, heralding a new phase in this escalating crisis.
We now have war in Europe on a scale and of a type we thought belonged to history. NATO allies condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine in the strongest possible terms. It is a blatant violation of international law.
In the capital, streets usually teeming with people became quiet. Not deserted, but fundamentally different to just 24 hours earlier. Within hours, it was clear a mass exodus had started. This man and his family told us they'd tried to get onto a train heading west. He said he was giving up, though, and going home. Without a car, you're stuck, he told me. The main roads heading out of Kiev were suddenly jammed with traffic. Miles and miles of queues. People getting out of buses for a break before continuing on. These women said they and everyone on the bus was heading to the west, maybe then onto Poland.